Well, good evening everyone. Tonight I'm presenting a repeat of a talk I gave near the beginning of the year called Food and Fellowship with the Risen Christ. We begin with a quote. "Listen to me, all of you, and understand, and if anyone has ears to hear, then let him hear this." These are words Jesus spoke after he called the multitude to draw near to him at Mark 7 verse 14. He did this in response to scribes and Pharisees who had just now found fault with his disciples for a serious violation of one of the many rules and regulations which Jewish tradition prescribed for food and fellowship. In this case, the disciples were seen eating bread together without first washing their hands. At issue was food, first of all, and then consequently fellowship itself. Firstly, food eaten with unwashed hands was believed to be unclean or non-kosher, which then also made the eater unclean, rendering him defiled, unholy, unacceptable to God. Secondly, anyone judged to be defiled this way was also regarded as a defiling influence on others who subsequently came in contact with him, which meant he must therefore be excluded from any association with those who were clean. In other words, he had no fellowship with them. To the diverse group, leaders, disciples, and multitudes that surrounded him, Jesus declared as plainly as possible what is one of the most basic truths any seeker of God's kingdom and righteousness should hope to grasp, which is that, in Jesus' words, there is nothing outside of a man which can defile him by going into him. But what defiles a man are the things which proceed out of man. But the complaint from the scribes and Pharisees was not merely about kosher table fellowship. In fact, for Jesus' audience who held the traditions of the venerated Jewish elders, Pharisees especially, who put most emphasis on purity and purification, on kosher laws of clean and unclean, related to almost every aspect of their lives. As most saw it, they were at risk of defilement from all sorts of external uncleanness, and while a staunch, pious Jew would never willingly associate with uncleanness, he might come in contact with it unintentionally or unknowingly, and would thus be considered defiled and separate from God in spite of all his piety and virtue. He imagined being assailed on every side by defiling influences, and thus had to be fastidious about keeping separate from them. He was careful not to touch or enter an unfamiliar dwelling. He daily washed and changed his clothes, bathed only in running water, cleansed furniture and utensils, whitewashed grave sites so they were easy to see and easy to avoid, and he filtered his drinks. He ceased charitable work on Sabbath days, according to Luke 13 verse 14. He tithed everything, according to Luke 18 verse 12. He kept his distance from the dying, used only kosher coins in the temple, according to John 2 verse 14 and Matthew 21 verse 12. And he did not enter the Roman Praetorium, according to John 18 verse 28, and wore broad phylacteries as an amulet or a charm to ward off evil. Avoiding or shielding himself against everything that could defile him might mean having to keep other people at a safe distance. A person deemed unclean posed a threat, and a pious Jew would need to exclude, distance, and segregate them from himself, which is why he was so averse to and offended by food and fellowship with people judged to be sinners. So for the scribes and Pharisees in Jesus' audience at Mark 7 verse 14, it was the risk to themselves of being defiled by contact with his unclean disciples that they were truly indignant about, a risk which extended, they believed, to their entire Jewish society and nation. Here then were two accusations in one: defilement by the committing of a sin and defilement by association. In calling out the disciples' dirty hands and their consequent uncleanness, these scribes and Pharisees implied that Jesus was spiritually defiled as well, either from his contact with the disciples or from his indulgence of their behavior, or on the presumption that they were following his example, because obviously disciples take after their leader. And thus it was necessary for Jesus, at Mark 7 verse 15, to deliver this forceful reply. There is nothing outside of a man which by going into him can defile him. But what truly defiles a man is everything that proceeds out of the man. Here he stated that what makes a man defiled before God, the source of his defilement, in other words, is himself, his own human flesh nature. Each man is the sole cause of his own defiled state and cannot attribute it to anything or anyone else but himself. Nothing else, no matter how unclean, and nobody else, however sinful, bears the blame for a man's own defilement and separation from God. And this is because, as Jesus went on to say at verses 21 through 23, all the evils which defile men proceed from out of the heart of men. The principle touches on every aspect of the lives of every human being, whether a seeker of God's righteousness or not. It is why we are all sinners and defiled before God, however much we focus on avoiding external evils and temptations. It is also, crucially, the very reason Jesus could so readily and gladly share table fellowship with all comers, however sinful, while his fellow Jews could not. They were constantly hung up on the false notion that other people could somehow defile them. But Jesus never had that hang up. In some previous talks, we considered the prominent role that commensality or table fellowship has in the record of Christ's ministry prior to his death. We noted how ready, willing, and available Jesus was to share the company of sinners around food and drink. And we saw how very desirous Jesus was to persist in the practice late into the night of his betrayal, even with his false accuser and traitor, Judas Iscariot. John's Gospel at chapter 13, verse 26, when he extended the morsel to Judas, is the last depiction of Jesus sharing table fellowship before his death. The role of food and fellowship continues to show up in the New Testament record of Christ's resurrection appearances during the 40 days or 6 weeks prior to Jesus' ascension to heaven. In paragraph 1 of his book of Acts, Luke wrote at verse 3 that after Jesus was raised from the dead, he presented himself alive by or with or in many infallible or convincing proofs. On reading this for the first time, we might have then eagerly searched the New Testament looking for Jesus to do more powerful and sensational miracles than he had ever done before his death. But we would not have imagined to instead find the vivid accounts of Jesus using food to present himself alive. In fact, the Gospels describe the Lord at 3 meal events after his resurrection, and the book of Acts also has a reference or two to the fact that the risen Lord had had table fellowship. The first such event recorded in the Gospels is at Luke chapter 24, after the risen Christ had walked unrecognized with 2 disciples along the road between Jerusalem and a town called Emmaus. On arriving there, with the afternoon starting to get late, Jesus accepted an offer from his fellow travelers to stay with them overnight. And at verses 30 through 31, we read, "It came about that when he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and on having broken it, he handed it to them. And their eyes were suddenly opened, and they recognized him, but then he vanished from their sight." Now this was in the late afternoon with still more than a good hour of sunlight, so in their excitement the 2 disciples ran something like 11 kilometers back to Jerusalem. With still a wee while to go until sunset, they found the 11 apostles plus some other disciples, and at verse 35, these men from Emmaus began to tell of their experiences on the road to Emmaus and how Jesus was known to them in the breaking of bread. This report by the men of Emmaus is the one alluded to at Mark 16 verses 12 through 13. But Mark's own report states that none of the apostles believed them, and Mark indicates at verse 14 that they were particularly hard-hearted in their unbelief. It was now, during what must have been a very emotional and troubled meeting, that the next recorded appearance of Jesus took place, recorded at Mark 6 from verse 14, Luke 24 from verse 36, and at John 20 from verse 19. John there states that it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, meaning it was still the day of the resurrection, but drawing towards its close as the sun was not far from setting. Jesus suddenly appeared from nowhere, causing quite a shock. Luke and John both say that he showed his disciples the wounds he received to his hands, to his feet, and to his side. And while John 20 verse 20 states that the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord, Luke 24 verse 41 explains that they were joyful, yet they still could not believe it was him and were instead actually marveling or wondering, much as if any of us saw some sort of an apparition. Luke goes on to say that in all the confusion of terror, fright, consternation and disbelief, Jesus then asked the disciples, "Have you got anything here to eat?" So they found pieces of dried fish and honeycomb and gave them to Jesus, and these he ate in front of the group. This first day of his resurrection had been a very big day for the Lord, but it is impossible that he was really hungry or in need of something to eat to keep his energy up. No, instead he ate among his disciples so as to help prove to them that he was truly alive. Even if he suddenly vanished as he had done in Emmaus, they would still have proof he had been there in the evidence of the food that he had eaten. They would know that the food had been there, now it was gone. And Jesus' eating of it was the explanation. John's Gospel records two more appearances, the last of which mentions food at some length. At John 21 verse 3, 7 apostles were in a fishing boat on Galilee where they had toiled all night but caught nothing. At daybreak, Jesus was on the lake shore and must have been visible to the men in the boat by then, as they were only about 100 yards from the beach, and Jesus had lit a fire there. But again he went unrecognized by them, according to verse 4. Jesus shouted out across the water to ask them essentially the same question he had asked on the first day. Did they have anything to eat? He meant, did they have any fish with them, which of course they did not. And it was only at his direction that they got a huge catch of fishes, after which the Apostle John then perceived he was the Lord, at verse 7. John told Simon Peter, who promptly believed it and leapt out of the boat to go to Jesus. But it is unclear if the other 5, as they rowed back to the beach, had either the same perception as John or the same conviction as Peter. Once all of them were ashore, at verse 9, they saw a charcoal fire and a fish already laid upon it, and bread. To them, this was obviously a meal the man had begun preparing earlier when they were all trying to catch something on the lake. And the single fish on the fire would suggest he was cooking it for himself, regardless of whether or not anyone else joined him. But next, at verse 10, he said, "Bring some of the fishes which you caught just now," which they could only have interpreted as his request to each of them to contribute to the meal so they might all share in it. And presumably, once Peter had hauled the net ashore, each of them killed and gutted a fish to put on the fire. Then the man said to them at verse 12, "Come and dine," which was unmistakably an invitation, the sort of summons they must have heard Jesus speak to numerous people countless times, so that verse 12 says, not one of the disciples ventured to ask him, "Who are you?" They perceived that he was the Lord. By then, they all knew this man was definitely their Lord Jesus, even if some of them had been unsure up until that moment. John's record emphasizes the point at verses 13 through 14, saying, "Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and likewise the fish. this being the third time now that Jesus had been manifested to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When considered altogether, accounts of Jesus' resurrection appearances in Luke and John's Gospels imply a correlation between Christ's manifestation along with food and his disciples' full recognition of him as the risen Lord. These inspired accounts conspicuously interlink food with Jesus' resurrection appearances and form such a high proportion of our total record of the 40 days. It seems plausible to infer that those noteworthy occasions of food and fellowship were the most prominent of the many proofs Luke alluded to at Acts 1 verse 3, or the most representative examples. Perhaps for those to whom Jesus presented himself alive, their experiences of sharing a meal with him were the most notable of all the convincing or infallible proofs. A small number of Christ's female disciples were the first people to pass on the incredible report that he was alive from the dead. Together, they all told Christ's closest male disciples that they had seen, heard, spoken to, and even touched the risen Lord. But Luke 24:11 says that despite their unanimous testimonies, the women were not believed and their words were regarded as idle tales. Corroboration for the women's story would come from other lines of evidence, such as the empty tomb and how the grave clothes were laid, and later there were sightings of saints who had reappeared out of their graves at Matthew 27 verse 53, and there was also later testimony from some soldiers who had guarded Jesus' tomb at Matthew 28 verse 11. Yet none of this evidence could provide infallible proof that Jesus was alive or prove the nature of his resurrected state. Whereas for witnesses in those early days especially, proof of his reappearance had to be rock solid. So it was essential that reported sightings of Jesus after his death not be easily dismissed as if they were dreams or hallucinations or instances of wishful thinking or mistaken identity. In a nation prone to superstitions, it was also necessary that the resurrection appearances not be equated with the ghosts or demons of paganism, which too many Jews, including some disciples, believed in. Equally vital was that the risen Lord not be confused with a rare category of people who, having been presumed dead, later emerge out of what we call today a vegetative state after having been in a coma over a few days, as some people do from drowning or freezing or cardiac arrest, for example. Usually, survivors of these events will be so impaired by oxygen deprivation to the brain, known as cerebral hypoxia, that they no longer retain the mental faculties and the personality traits that they originally had. Even mild cases present declines in memory, concentration, attention span, clarity of vision and coordination, and may show noticeable headaches, dizziness, sweating and rapid breathing, or even speech impediments, partial paralysis and epileptic episodes. A few months ago, American NFL player Damar Hamlin, collapsed on the field and his heart stopped for about 1 minute. And although he was fully revived in hospital, physicians on the Thursday cautioned that he is demonstrating signs of good neurological recovery, but that it was too soon to comment on his long-term medical prognosis. A survivor of such a heart attack or of freezing or of suffocation can be said to have escaped death or won the game of his life, as Hamlin was told, but often the whole person he or she once was never returns. Close friends and family see in them not a familiar friend or loved one, but a stranger, someone more like a zombie, whose return from the dead is often as much a cause for grief and anguish as when they initially lost their beloved one in the first place. Yet in their desperation to reject the gospel, many skeptics do try to attribute Jesus' resurrection to just these sorts of resurrection events. And obviously it doesn't hold. We know that Jesus was cogent. He was witnessed by many people who were with him well enough, for long enough to know that he was not impaired in any way. So all these possible explanations, alternatives, and arguments which might otherwise have been aimed at refuting Christ's resurrection appearances are soundly contradicted by the fact that those appearances were also occasions of table fellowship shared between the risen Christ himself and his many witnesses. By eating with his followers again, Jesus presented himself alive not merely as the same body, but as the same personality and character, the very same person with the same disposition and temperament they had all grown to know, love, and venerate. His resurrection appearances are the most transcendent examples of fellowship that his disciples ever had with Jesus. So it is fitting that those occasions were joined with food and drink. For as we all know from even our more mundane experience, eating and drinking are always the perfect complement to times of joyful and edifying contact. Regarding evidence in the book of Acts that Jesus had had food and fellowship after his resurrection, it is tempting to say that Acts chapter 1 verse 4 is the first reference on record. Where verse 4 records Jesus' so-called assembling or gathering the apostles, several New Testament translations and commentaries note the possibility that it more literally means eating with them. The store of evidence for either option is many and varied based on different reputable ancient manuscripts, plus the use of two dissimilar Greek words and the usage and application of those words in pagan writings contemporary with Luke. However, even the best of biblical scholarship has not reached a definitive conclusion about which is the more authentic reading. All else being equal, I would opt for Jesus eating with his disciples at Acts 1 verse 4, since in the context of him speaking to them and then commanding them, a reference to assembling or gathering the disciples would seem to go without saying, and it adds no useful information, whereas a reference to eating with them is a useful additional fact that would not otherwise have been got from the immediate context. I have read many scholarly articles that insist that the true translation is eating with them, but you can take or leave that. It's still disputed by many scholars. At Acts 10, some 10 years after the Apostle Simon Peter first preached in Jerusalem, he was living on the Judean coast in a town called Joppa when he was led by the Spirit to preach the gospel for the first time to a Gentile household. This was in the home of a Roman centurion named Cornelius at the nearby coastal city of Caesarea. It was here that Peter referred to Christ as having had table fellowship with his disciples after his resurrection, and it proves to be a particularly informative reference. When Peter set out at verse 23, some brethren from Joppa accompanied him. Acts 11 verse 12 explains that 6 brethren had gone together with Peter into the house of Cornelius. The identities of the 6 are not recorded, but they were evidently not any of the 12 apostles. For chapter 11 verse 1 states that the other apostles only learned of the Gentiles' conversion after the events of chapter 10 had already happened. And later at Acts chapter 15 verse 7, Peter said that he alone of the apostles had been chosen by God to preach the gospel to the Gentiles for the first time. At chapter 10 verses 34 right through to 43 is recorded Peter's gospel testimony to Cornelius. Speaking about Jesus, Peter said at verses 40 through 41, "This man did God raise up on the 3rd day, and granted that he should be openly visible, not to all the people, but to witnesses who were chosen beforehand by God, to us who ate and drank with him after he arose from the dead." Now, to Cornelius and his household, the phrase Peter used, saying, "us who ate and drank with Jesus," would have been a reference to their present company, Peter himself plus his 6 friends with him there in Cornelius's house. And quite obviously, when Peter said us, he had indeed meant himself and his 6 brethren from Joppa, which reveals that while the 6 with him were not part of the 12-person apostolic band of which Peter was a member, they had nonetheless had a similar experience of the risen Lord that Peter had done. Also obvious, though, is that Peter never meant he and his 6 companions were the only ones who had that experience, so his use of the word us had to have been inclusive of everyone else who had eaten and drunk with the risen Lord, including, of course, the other apostles, as we know. Note how Peter framed his statement here at verses 40 through 41, and notice what he was saying. His statement presents details which are all interconnected to describe one particular category of persons. In this statement, the subject is God himself, who, having firstly raised up his Son on the 3rd day, then, in Peter's words, granted that Christ should become visible to witnesses who were chosen beforehand by God, us who ate and drank with Christ after he arose from the dead. Here Peter refers to an assortment of people who, collectively, were in a class of their own and whom he defined in 3 different ways. First, those to whom God granted that Jesus should become visible. Second, those chosen beforehand by God to be witnesses. Third, those who ate and drank with Jesus after he rose from the dead. In Peter's words, God did a work with a number of people whom he had pre-selected to be witnesses of the risen Christ. And Peter identifies those witnesses as people who ate and drank with the risen Christ. Peter here was not describing different types of witnesses, but one and the same collective, one and the same coterie, if you like, of witnesses. So there was not one group of witnesses who ate and drank with Christ and another group of witnesses who did not. If ever there was a class of Christians who might properly be called exclusive and elite, it was this, whom Peter described to Cornelius, a uniquely privileged coterie of people, all of whom had seen the risen Lord and eaten and drunk with him and were tasked with being first-hand witnesses of his resurrection. Now, gospel accounts of the risen Lord are very focused on the initial incomprehension or disbelief shown by the disciples in the earliest days of Christ's reappearance. This was true of the women as well as of the 12 apostles and other male disciples gathered with them on the first day of the resurrection. The gospel accounts were not recorded to give a complete picture of the number and diversity of total resurrection appearances, but Christ appeared to very many more witnesses than are even hinted at in the Gospels. 1 Corinthians 15 verses 5 through 7 seems to be a more or less complete chronological list of Christ's appearances to male disciples up to the Apostle Paul's own Damascus Road experience. If not for this account, 3 of the appearances which Paul referred to would otherwise have gone unrecorded in the New Testament. We do not know the identity or full number of all those who were privileged to see the risen Christ, but between the testimony of Paul at 1 Corinthians 15 and the selection of accounts in the Gospels, the representative summary in our New Testament is surely a good indication. From Paul's account of the resurrection appearances, we know the names of those witnesses who came to have the most authority in the New Testament church. There was Simon Peter, whom Paul referred to by his Greek name Cephas at verse 5. There were all the other 12 apostles, which at some time must have included a brother named Matthias, who was later numbered with the 11 apostles once he became Judas Iscariot's replacement at Acts 1 verse 26. There was also the Lord's natural half-brother James at 1 Corinthians 15 verse 7, which is particularly remarkable because according to John 7 verse 5, in the latter half of Jesus' ministry, James and his siblings had no longer believed in Jesus. Yet they were converts after the resurrection, and, together with their mother Mary and other female disciples, they continued in one accord with the 12 apostles, according to Acts chapter 1, verse 14. There was another group of witnesses whom Paul referred to as all the apostles. Now, these apostles were not the 12, but were designated apostles nonetheless, and many are named as such in the New Testament, including at least one and possibly two women. It probably also included the man who was not in the end chosen to replace Judas Iscariot, a man named Joseph Barsabas, at Acts chapter 1 verse 23, who was technically as qualified as Matthias to be an apostle, but who didn't become the apostle because the lot didn't fall to him. Luke chapter 10 refers to 70 disciples whom Jesus appointed and sent out on a mission which was identical to that of his 12 apostles a chapter earlier at Luke chapter 9. Most, if not all, of the 70 will have been among the apostles mentioned by Paul at 1 Corinthians 15 verse 7. We know from 1 Corinthians 15 verse 6 that the number of witnesses Paul mentioned is in excess of 500 brethren. And because Paul's testimony here does not refer to women, not even those named in the Gospels, whom we know did see and have contact with the risen Christ, it is conceivable that Paul's list accounts for only about half the number of witnesses to the risen Lord, and we might estimate that the true total was more like 1,000 individuals. Whatever the number, it was comprised of the very people Simon Peter made reference to at Acts chapter 10 verses 40 through 41. The people God had chosen beforehand to be witnesses of the resurrection, people to whom Jesus became visible and who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. Remember that there were not two classes of witnesses to Christ's resurrection, one that ate and drank with him and another that did not. Everyone who saw the risen Lord also ate and drank with him. The conclusion then is fairly obvious that since all the witnesses Paul wrote about were in the same circle of witnesses Peter spoke about, it follows that those who ate and drank with the risen Christ, according to Peter's speech to Cornelius, must have included all of the more than 500 witnesses to Christ's resurrection listed in Paul's epistle to the Corinthians. Now, the jury is still out concerning Acts 1 verse 4, and in the final analysis, Peter's words to Cornelius might be the only evidence from the book of Acts of the risen Christ's wide-ranging participation in table fellowship before he ascended to heaven. But all the same, it is remarkably clear and convincing evidence, I believe. For the hundreds of witnesses to the risen Christ, their abiding memories of those extraordinary fellowship meals could not fail but to keep personal conviction in the fact of the resurrection appearances strong and clear and lucid in their minds. Even when their gospel message was stubbornly disbelieved by others, and even if they were persistently disadvantaged or persecuted for their testimony, the essential fact of having shared food and fellowship with He who had been dead and is alive again would constantly anchor their faith in and bolster their courage to proclaim the glad tidings of the gospel by which life and immortality are brought to light. This is especially so because their experience of the risen Lord had brought into play all their five senses, obviously sight, hearing and touch, but smell and taste as well. And it is not an irrelevant or trivial fact that of all the physical senses humans depend on, smell and taste are the two which most powerfully evoke memories and the strong emotions associated with them. This physiology, called olfactory memory, is well known to evoke long forgotten or repressed memories with a power no other physical sense can achieve. Over time, memory can fail us. Recollection of details become indistinct, if not confused. Yet, For critical or momentous things, even from one's distant past, the essential facts are usually never lost in our brain's software. So in later decades, whenever a witness of the resurrection smelled or tasted the same food or drink as he had shared years ago with his risen Lord, he would be transported in memory back to that original time and scene. Acts chapter 10 tells how the apostle Simon Peter was led to go from the city of Jaffa to Caesarea and to share the gospel with the household of the centurion named Cornelius, as we have considered earlier. Next to the concept of a suffering Messiah, the very idea that Gentiles who were neither schooled in the law of Moses nor initiated into Judaism, then being admitted into the kingdom of God, was easily the biggest stumbling block in the way of Jews readily accepting the gospel. To a devout Jew, the Gentiles were actually a lower type of being, something in the order of dogs or pigs, and that was no matter how capable or successful they were. Devout Jews, like Peter and his fellow Christians, were brought up to regard Gentiles as a lower order of being, creatures no closer to God than the animals, whose only hope was conversion to Judaism and the law of Moses. The idea of those heathen sharing salvation with them was inconceivable, as bad a stumbling block to Jews accepting the gospel as the thought of a crucified Messiah. Acts 10 then relates in detail how the very first completely Gentile community came to receive the gospel. What led to that radical event was the revelation Simon Peter received on his rooftop while living in Joppa. It was midday, and at verse 10, he became hungry and desired to eat. But while his brethren prepared lunch, Peter fell into a trance in which he was shown all kinds of unclean beasts, birds and creepy crawlies, which the voice of the Lord commanded him to kill and to eat. Peter objected. It was offensive to him, unthinkable, that he, a born and bred Jew, would touch, let alone eat, any non-kosher animal. 3 times the command was given, "Arise, Peter, kill and eat." 3 times Peter protested, "By no means, Lord, I have never eaten anything common and unclean." But to every protest, the voice replied, "What God has cleansed, do not consider common." For Jews, the word common meant all that is in the world, everything not of God, things godless, profane, or unholy. Yet Peter was being told that God can cleanse even these. They can be made holy. Then the replies to Peter's protest was a command, as sacred and binding as anything in Moses' law. Thou shalt not consider unholy what God has made holy. Well, Peter emerged from his trance greatly perplexed about the vision, but the Spirit of God told him he must go without any misgivings with the men who had been sent to him. The proof God was in all this was that 3 men were at the gate at that very time asking for Peter. So out of that special trance and vision came Peter's first contact with the household of Cornelius, and the first Gentiles to be baptized after hearing and believing the gospel of Jesus Christ. From his vision of non-kosher animals, Peter was convinced that the Lord was revealing something which had he never considered before, but which he would naturally have been resistant to, if not downright opposed to. To his credit, Peter was honest and humble enough to reconsider and then abandon a lifelong belief that not only had been rock solid in his mind, but was the universal and unquestioned belief of all his peers. By the time Peter was downstairs, his prejudice against Gentiles was sufficiently corrected that he could invite Cornelius's 3 servants to lodge overnight in his own home, at verses 21 through 23. Next day, the apostle showed how far his spiritual bias had been overturned when he willingly entered Cornelius's house and was surrounded by Gentiles. Peter said at verse 28, You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him, and yet God has shown me that I should not call any man profane or unclean. Recall that this was some 10 years after Pentecost, and so it was after the ministry which Peter had participated in with Jesus, where Jesus would often interact with people that were regarded as strangers or foreigners by the Jews. And I think in particular of the Syrophoenician woman, but also of the 4,000 who were miraculously fed with fish and bread in the region of the Decapolis. It is almost certain that all of those 4,000 were Gentiles. And so Jesus had demonstrated the fact that his call was also for Gentiles. Syrophoenician woman who was blessed by Jesus, and the 4,000 of Decapolis who were fed and sustained by Jesus. And yet the prejudice against the Gentiles was so strong in the Jews that even those Jews that were converted to Christianity did not initially push past that prejudice. It may be that not until he was given the vision in Jaffa did Peter really grasp the words at Mark 7, which I commenced this talk with, where Jesus said that nothing going into a man defiles him, only what comes out of a man. In verses 18 through 19 of that passage, first of all, Jesus is recorded as saying that whatever goes into the stomach goes out into the latrine. And his words is an inserted remark explaining that Jesus thus declared all foods clean. Mark's Gospel is generally believed to be Peter's account of events written years afterward, so the remark inserted in verse 19 is probably Peter's comment added in light of his new revelation from the events at Acts 10. And if so, it emphasizes Peter's newfound understanding of what Jesus had sought to teach him all those years ago. Peter gained from his revelation at Acts 10 a better view of how the heart of man is the true source of defilement, and how God's true basis of holiness is the grace and truth of Christ. Only then was Peter set free in his mind to fellowship others who, for his entire life prior to that momentous experience, he had considered incompatible with his concept of holiness, the concept he held first as a Jew under the law, but also as a law-abiding Jewish disciple of Christ. Over those few days in Joppa and then in Caesarea, Christ and the glad tidings about him were again seen to be revolutionary, for the Gentiles, of course, but equally for the church, which was still virtually 100% Jewish. In Acts 11, after the church throughout Judea heard that Gentiles had received the word of God, we read that Peter arrived in Jerusalem as if he was answering a court summons. The charge that his fellow disciples put to him at verse 3 says it all. You went to uncircumcised men and ate with them. It was an accusation. It was a criticism. Luke wrote this about 3 decades after the fact, at a time when there were scores of Gentile churches and thousands of uncircumcised Christians, whereas on the day that Peter had visited Cornelius, circumcised Christians were the only kind there was, whether Jews or proselytes or Samaritans. Their bias against Gentiles was an ancient, time-honoured and venerable tradition that could not easily be challenged. To produce such conviction among Christian leaders, which gave the impetus necessary to propel them past their traditional thinking, it took the revelation which God gave Peter in Joppa, and then the Holy Spirit which God poured out on Cornelius' house, and then the authoritative testimony which Peter spoke to the Jerusalem church, apparently in the face of considerable interjections. It was only after Peter asked, "Who was I to be able to forbid God?" It was only after Peter asked them this rhetorical question that then the critics quieted down or held their peace and conceded at verse 18, saying, "Well then, God has indeed granted the repentance that leads to life to the Gentiles as well. Luke noted at verse 2 of that chapter that the criticism against Peter was made by those of the circumcision. Obviously, as we've just mentioned, those of the circumcision at that time were the only Christians that there were, certainly among the leadership, not including Cornelius' household, of course. But Luke noted that in these terms, those of the circumcision, to forecast that it was Christians such as these converted from Judaism who would continue to pose a challenge to Gentile converts. It would prove to be as great a threat to the church as anything. The influence of Christians still bound to legalism, pedantry, and exclusiveness. As Jesus had said, threat of defilement is not from outside, but from within. We learn from the Apostle Paul at Galatians 2 verse 9 that in apostolic times Simon Peter was reputed to be a pillar in the church. Nevertheless, Simon Peter was not infallible. He was not like the Pope. The Gospels revealed Peter's tendency to instability at least 7 times, and only about a decade after his mission to Cornelius took place, Peter revealed his instability once again by his woeful inconsistency toward fellowshipping Gentile brethren. In Galatians 2, the Apostle Paul refers to Peter by his Aramaic name, Cephas, and describes at verses 11 through 14 how Peter, or Cephas, stumbled and backslid badly in his practice of table fellowship. As Paul tells it, Cephas had come to understand that the Lord had freed him from the Mosaic law and the traditions of Judaism, and Cephas knew that a man is never justified by works of the law, but through faith in Christ Jesus. Knowing the truth and sacredness of these principles, whenever Cephas was staying among the Gentile converts he lived much like they did, and he shared table fellowship with Gentile Christians without any qualms or problems, just as he had done only a matter of years ago in the days he spent with Cornelius. Through the ministry of Cephas and others, Christ's example of table fellowship was being spread and optimized as it was designed to, breaking out from Judea and breaking out from the Jewish communities to reach out to the whole wide world. But it came about, so Paul recounts in Galatians 2, it came about that Christ's half-brother, James, a Christian leader in Jerusalem at the time, sent certain men to the community in which Cephas fellowshipped with the Gentile Christians. The men who were sent from James were of the circumcision, meaning brethren of Judaistic persuasion, and on their arrival, Cephas was intimidated by them. So fearful of the visitors was he that rather than offend and get offside with them, he chose to withdraw and keep himself aloof from his Gentile brothers and sisters instead. Cephas completely violated the spirit and example of Christ by what he did, and he should not have done so. Jesus had never refused table fellowship to others just to keep the peace with legalistic Pharisaical types, and Cephas knew this full well. As if his un-Christ-like action was not evil enough, it set an example for the fellow Jewish Christians in his circle, causing them to imitate his un-Christian behavior, with the result that even Paul's fellow missionary worker, Barnabas, was persuaded to do the same. Paul says at verse 11 of Galatians 2, "When Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned." The Greek word means noted against or thought ill of. This was a severe black mark against Cephas. All followers of Christ will wish to avoid receiving such a judgment, for it said in essence that Cephas had been found wanting and was All followers of Christ will wish to avoid receiving such a judgment, for it said in essence that Cephas had been found wanting and was no longer free from the law of sin and death, for he was no longer living by the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus. So it could no longer be said of Cephas that there is therefore no condemnation. Paul had to confront the entire church at the same time. And he said at verse 14, "When I saw that they were not being straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of them all, 'You, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles instead of like Judaistic Jews. So how dare you compel the Gentile Christians to live as Judaizers?'" Now, regardless of the fact that some of these brethren were apostles, none of them were spared Paul's indictment of their behaviour, which he described in no uncertain terms. At verse 13, Paul called Cephas's action, plus that of the other Jewish Christians who joined him in it, hypocrisy. The way Barnabas was also swept up and carried away by actions of his, the brethren, Paul identified with the same hypocrisy. Jesus himself reserved some of his most hostile and scathing language for calling out people's hypocrisy, and here it was being used in a tongue lashing from Paul against Christians whose sin was a fatally wrong concept of the grace and mercy of Christ. Here were Christians who were intimidated into trying to squeeze Christ and his church back into the mold of exclusive and legalistic Judaism, the very system Jesus had proved could not save and out of which he sought to call all his followers. Hypocrites they were, play actors at true Christianity. This was one of Paul's harshest judgments on anyone. It was tantamount to calling these men fake disciples. With that, I finish this evening.